into this guy here, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. He's influenced by the Rebbe, and so in this particular one, he talks about leadership and all of that. So he goes into, for particularly for Parshas Messiah, he calls it leadership at a time of crisis. And in this one, he says, that Messiah happens during the 3 weeks, and then he says that we read during the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, we read about Moses' message to generations at the beginning of Devorah. It's always read the Shabbos before Tisha B'Av, and as Isaiah, his vision is he gives us the vision to the day of Shabbos Chazan, and the prophet Jeremiah also he forms our Haftorah for 2 of the 3 weeks. So he discusses them as leaders in this thing, and he says that there are 3 qualities, 3 things that set them apart from all the other leaders that were amongst the Jewish people. So he says, first, they were all prophets of hope. Even in their darkest moments, they were able to see through the clouds of disaster to the clear sky beyond. They were not optimists. We talked earlier about the difference between optimism and hope. Optimism is the belief that things will get better. Hope is the belief that if we work hard enough together, we can make things better. It takes no courage to be an optimist, but it takes courage, wisdom, a deep understanding of history and possibility, as well as the ability to communicate, to be a prophet of hope. And that's what Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah all were. And he says the second characteristic was that they delivered their criticism in love. And then he gives examples of that. And the third thing he says is Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah were the 3 prophets who, more than any others, spoke about the role of Jews and Israel in the context of humanity as a whole. Moses directed the people to keep the commands, for they are your wisdom and understanding in the eyes of the nations. Devorah chapter 4, verse 6. Isaiah said in God's name, you are my witnesses that I am God. And I created you and appointed you a covenant people, a light of nations, opening eyes deprived of light, rescuing prisoners from confinement, from the dungeon, those who sit in darkness. And Jeremiah was the leader who defined for all time the role of Jews in diaspora. Seek the welfare of the city to which I have exiled you, and pray to the Lord on its behalf, for in its prosperity you shall prosper. The first statement in history of what it is to be a creative minority. So why did this universal perspective matter? Because those who care only for their own people are chauvinists. These are his words, not mine, just, going there. They create false expectations, narrow and self-regarding emotions, and bravado rather than real courage. Moses had to show, as he did when he rescued Yittro's daughters from the local shepherd, that he cared for non-Israelites as well as Israelites. Jeremiah was told by God to become a prophet to the nations, not to just Israel. And Isaiah, in one of the most remarkable prophecies of all time, showed as much concern for Egypt and Assyria, Israel's enemies, as for Israel itself. Great leaders are great not just because they care for their own people. Everyone except the self-hater does that, but because they care for humanity. That is what gives their devotion to their its dignity and moral strength. To be an agent of hope, to love the people you lead, and to widen their horizons, to embrace humanity as a whole. That is the kind of leadership that gives people the ability to recover from crisis and move on. It is what made Moses, Isaiah, and Jeremiah 3 of the greatest leaders of all time. And earlier in that text, he also said that we as Jews have an obligation to be we have to be leaders. It's necessary for all of us to be leaders. We're a nation of priests, and priests are usually leaders, at least in the context of Kohanim, etc. So that is my Devorah Torah. So I hope that we can take that and use that to influence everything we talk about this week, today, in this talk. And yeah, I give it back to you, Shoshana.
Yeah, Yasher, thank you so much. And that was like the perfect Devorah Torah for what we are talking about because of all the things you mentioned, but hope and the gift that you're giving, that you and Yaffy are giving us, which is labor intensive. There's an emotional toll to talking about this, but what you're doing is you're investing in us your hope that we will do better, and your optimism and your leaders. So I really appreciate that again. And I was asked to ask everyone to turn off your video, not Maayan and Yaffy. And if you have any questions, you're welcome to leave them in the chat. And then if we do have time, then we will get to them at the end. I'm just going to introduce myself quickly. My name is Shoshana Greenwald, and I am an educator, consultant, and design historian. And my social media work is about creating spaces where Jewish women can engage in social justice without diminishing our Jewishness at all. So I was very honored to be asked to moderate. And Yaffy, would you please introduce yourself? And as part of the introduction, can you also give us a sense of what your earliest experience was with racism in the Frum community?
Yeah, so first off, thank you. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. I know that it means a lot to all of us who put in the time to be here, and for what we're all here doing, the reasons that we're here. I was born and raised into an Orthodox community. I grew up in South Florida, and since I had the luxury of being born into the community that I was born into, from a very young age, I wasn't immediately smacked in the face with racism. And by young age, I mean like 2 years old, 3 years old. But my first interaction with racism was outside of my community. At about 4 or 5 years old, we went to a Hanukkah party, my parents and I. And you know how it is when you have kids. You want to go to different places. You want to keep them entertained, especially during the holidays, and especially if you're raising Jewish kids in America, where your community is everything. It's good for the kids to have that feeling. So that was my parents' mindset, and they took me to a Hanukkah party that was hosted by a certain organization out of the community. I was having a great time. I was playing with the other little kids, and all of a sudden, I remember the mother of the 2 children that I was playing with running up into where we were playing, yanking her kids fairly aggressively away from me. And as she walked away, saying, "You don't play with Schwarzes. Schwarzes are dirty." Now, as a 4 or 5-year-old, you don't really tend to understand until you're explained, until you learn, until you're told what certain things mean, the weight, the gravity. And I recall walking away and going to my parents and being confused and wiping my face and looking at my hands and being like, well, we weren't playing in the dirt, but I don't know, maybe I have chocolate on my face. Maybe I am physically dirty. And I asked my parents, am I dirty? And they, of course, were confused. So why I was asking that. They're like, no, why? And I was like, well, we were playing. And she said that they can't play with me because I'm a Schwarza and that I'm dirty. And that was my first interaction with racism. My parents always had the approach of doing it at an age-appropriate way, but of always being honest with me about the realities of life and the world that I live in. So they, in a watered-down way that a 4 or 5-year-old could understand, essentially explained what that woman had insinuated by calling me a Schwarza and explaining to her children that I was dirty. So that probably is one of my earliest memories surrounding racism.
Thank you. All right. Maayan, can you tell us a little bit about yourself And just a reminder, I meant to say this at the beginning, that we're discussing lived experiences here. That means that when somebody tells us they lived through something, something happened, we don't argue that. And maybe it'll come up again later, but I'm just setting that as a parameter for this. Maayan, can you introduce yourself, please, and share with us one of your early experiences with racism in the Frum community?
Okay. So the journey is long. I guess we could explain that later. But I'll say my earliest experience with racism in the Frum community was the beginning, when I wanted to first go to 770, and someone told me about a large menorah, and they're like, hey, oh, it's Hanukkah too. Wow. Okay, just by chance. Anyway, so Hanukkah, things happen. Anyway, yeah, so went to 770, figured out the women's section, because that was also a foreign idea to me, like a women's section versus a man's section. But in any case, figured out the women's section, then finally, like, you know, going in, trying to figure out the lay of the land inside the building, and then finding these two women who were just like, what are you doing here? You need to leave, you need to get out. And they're screaming at me at the top of their lungs, get out, get out, get out. Oh my, sorry. Fire.
Sound effects.
Fireworks, sound effects. My neighbors are adding adding some effects. But in any case, very dramatic, just, you know, they scared me out of the place. They ran, like literally chased me out of 770, spitting after me, like the whole 9 yards of, and I'd never, ever, ever experienced anything like that in my life. I grew up in DC, and even if people in DC had their you know, intolerances towards people of color, you know, they kept it to themselves for the most part. You know, it's not, you know, that kind of thing. But in any case, it wasn't this outright racism like that was. Literally, they were just like, you're black, like, what are you doing in here? You don't belong here, get out, and spitting after me and the whole thing. And I went running home crying, and that is my first experience with the racism here in Crown Heights.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like the Jewish community and the Frum community has work to do with our racism, and now is probably a good time to remind everyone that when someone says that you've done something racist, it doesn't mean you're not a good person. It's not the same thing. And there's also a spectrum, and there's microaggressions, which is when people hurt you and they don't even mean to, and then there's outright racist behavior, which is what both of you experienced that. Both of you described that. Can one of you talk about the Jewish community at large, and like the types, what you see, the types of racism or the spectrum of behavior and language, from open bigotry to those subtle comments? Yaffy, oh, I meant Maayan, sorry. Maayan, you want to take this one first?
Sure. It's been, you know, I know there's like an halacha that you're not supposed to ask people if they're ger or if they're like, what's their background story, but I do get that question a lot, like, and it's always kind of like sneaky, what I think in my head, like a sneaky language, like, so what's your journey? How did you get here? And like things like that, things of that nature. And well, yeah, you might be curious, and maybe one day, well, I'm telling you right now, so I guess it's no longer a mystery. So anyway, but in any case, but in a shul context, in the context of just meeting a person, it's very like, just like literally the first time like anyone meets me, immediately that's the question they have, because in their head they've already assumed that I'm a ger. or that only Black people could be Jewish because they're a ger, and that's not true, especially like, you know, in the case of Yaffy as well. But, you know, I do happen to be a ger at the moment, but that's because my background is slightly ambiguous in ways that are not exactly clear. So in order to just be, you know, to be straightforward and clear about the whole thing, clear the whole thing up, just conversion, and that's it. Um, but in
What
any
you're saying is you're not automatically accepted into Jewish spaces. You're asked to like prove why you belong, and there's an assumption just based on the way you look.
yeah, yeah. What else? Just being, you know, just being the person that everyone stares at when you're coming through the door, and the continuance of that staring, and or just weird comments or touching my hair for no reason at all, just like not even asking my permission, just like, oh, that's nice. I'm like, I'm not a pet, and I'm not your cat or whatever you might pet. Things like that. I mean, Yaffy, continue because I'm slowly.
Sure, go ahead, Yaffy.
Yeah, for sure. Could you just restate the question?
Oh, goodness. It was about the Jewish community and how we approach and what our particular issues with race are, and how there's a spectrum, there's behavior, there are things that are particular to us as a community.
Right. So I also, before we go deeper into this conversation, want to say something that I think I could say in Maayan's name as well, which is that I don't enter any part of this conversation as someone who's bitter. Negative experiences are negative, and they are painful, and they are indeed hurtful, but my Jewish identity is my Jewish identity, and this is my home. Like, you know, you people, you're my community. And no matter how many negative experiences I may have had, I just want everyone here to understand that this conversation is not a conversation to sit here and be like, oh my God, the Jews are terrible and they're so racist and everything sucks. Like, no, we're here doing this, having this conversation simply to raise awareness about an issue that affects so many people at large, and also specifically so many Jews who have skin tones and features like me and Maayan and a whole host of other features. So I just wanted to state that before we went any deeper.
Wait, can I also add that that, you know, I think what's surprising about this, like, okay, it's one thing to get criticism or racism, like, discriminated by, say, non-Jews and that sort of thing, but for a community to discuss and to promote Ahavas Yisrael and the unity of all the Jewish people as one, we're one big family, we're brothers and sisters, et cetera, to promote that, but then go, but actually this group of Jews, no. Maybe not. And I'm not saying that everyone does that, you know, there's subtleties to all of that, and I don't want to ever blanket generalize or put anyone in that corner, but I'm just saying, like, it's just a really surprising behavior to encounter, especially when we learn that, you know, we're supposed to love each other as ourselves, and recognize that, okay, there are Jews that come in all colors, and that my mother would say pink, purple, polka dot, whatever. Anyway, but yeah.
I just want to reflect both what you both said, and reflect to the audience that your sharing your experiences with us is an act of love. It's an act of Ahavas Yisrael. You love the Frum community. You are part of the Frum community. And for everyone that's here, I think it's an act of Ahavas Yisrael too. I also think that doing it at this time, as Maayan mentioned, during the 3 weeks when we know about the sin of sinas chinam, baseless hatred, is very powerful. And I only hope that with our discussion and with everybody who has decided to join us here, even though we're going to hear uncomfortable things, and we will be uncomfortable, that it will bring us closer to Mashiach and to the Geula.
I mean, So sorry for the tangent, guys. I just thought it was important for Maayan and I to discuss that. But to speak about race and the Jewish community, I think one of the most important things that really pushed me to start speaking out about this is the fact that so many people in my community, and when I say my community, I mean the editorial like the greater Jewish community in the world, find it very difficult to recognize any contribution or any racist thing that they may have or might be doing, because they feel like, as Maayan brought up, as Jews, we're taught these values and we're good people, or at least we strive to be, and we're doing our best. And that is so true. I know that I strive to do my best, but that doesn't mean that I'm perfect. And I can simultaneously be trying to do my best while still hurting other people. And for me, that leads into two of the biggest problems that I run into as a Frum Jew. To the people who are overtly racist, I don't feel like I'm speaking to them. I don't feel like anyone who's overtly racist is going to show up for a talk like this. So those who are overtly racist, those people are on the side. That's their decision. I'm not going to argue with someone who wants to treat me with such hatred just for something so surface level, such as how I look, the skin that I was born with. However, for all the other people who genuinely feel like they do not contribute to this problem, or like they never do it, I think the two biggest things that I hit is colorblindness and microaggressions. I know that there's someone who's very near and dear to my heart, who one time shared a story with me that they were speaking with someone outside of my circle, and they were saying something about race, and they brought me up as an example because I'm a part of their life. And that person looked at them and they said, well, Yaffy isn't Black. And my friend was like, what? But she is. Like, what do you mean she's not Black? Like, do you know, like, her ancestry, her lineage? Like, she is very much so a Black woman. And this person knew me as a member of the Frum community down here in South Florida. And as a result, they were unable, because they were so used to me being a fixture in the community, because like I said, I was born into my community. I was raised from day one in my community. My parents are both Jewish also. We weren't newbies to this whole thing, so to speak. They were incapable of seeing the reality that is, I am indeed a Black woman. I am also a Frum Jew, but I'm a Black woman. And the problem with that is that then when someone wants to talk about the issues that come along with being a Black woman, people are unable to see that. And they're unable to hear that. And that causes a whole host of problems, because a person can be drowning, but if everyone is incapable of seeing that person under the water, then no one's going to be able to ever help that person. The other thing is microaggressions. And those come in all forms, all the time. From things such as what Maayan brought up, for example, like people coming and petting my hair and being like, oh, wow, like, it's actually soft. Like, I want to put something out there, guys. Black women have different kinds of hair, different types, different everything. I remember once someone ran their fingers through my hair and they're like, wow, like, it's soft. I can run my fingers through it. It's not what I envisioned. Or other things like when I leave my community, because for the most part in my community and in my circle, because I grew up here, as I said, I don't tend to run into these things as often, or people try to be a little bit more sensitive. But whenever I leave my community, people being like, oh, wow, like you knew what you were doing during Shemona Esrei. Like, wow, like that's so surprising. And like, you knew how to answer the Kaddish. Like, where'd you learn that? Like, so interesting. And I think these are things that oftentimes, if you were to call the person out in the moment, they would say, well, no, I was just curious. And that's totally valid. But we teach little kids that just because they're curious about something, they either need to find a polite way to broach the topic, or that some things simply aren't polite and aren't okay to smack someone in the face with. So I think those, for me, are the two biggest reasons that I'm speaking to my broader Jewish community. Because I think these are two things that really, really hurt Jews of color, Jews of different backgrounds even. And it's one of my biggest struggles that I run into.
Thank you. Thank you. Maayan, is there anything you want to add specifically about color blindness or microaggressions? And we're going to talk about the shades later, right? Right, ladies?
Yeah. I don't know, like I just have a story to add to that, I guess. Like one time I was driving and a friend was talking about, well, she's like, oh, these schwarzes, I can't with them, like, I don't know, whatever. And so my husband was sitting in the back and he was like, oh, you mean like the schwarze sitting right beside you? And so she was like, oh my goodness, I didn't, no, that's not what I meant. Yeah, no, not you. I mean, you're different. I mean, like, you're Jewish and you're not like them, like them. And so she apologized and the whole thing, but it was just a little bit like, oh, this is kind of awkward. It's like, and I didn't like end my friendship with her just because of that comment or anything. I mean, you know, people make mistakes, it happens, and she was willing to acknowledge that she made a mistake, and you know, and she was more careful about it moving forward. But you know, just things like that happen where like sometimes even at a dinner or a Shabbos table, you know, people start talking about this, go da 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 da, and it's like, oh well, wow, Google is just amazing on this plate today, and I'll just concentrate over here. And it becomes a little bit of this awkward, you know, like you become othered, you know, like, and you're supposed to feel one at the Shabbos table, and then all of a sudden someone smacks you in the face with other. And they didn't realize it, but you know, and it's kind of awkward to be at someone else's house and to bring it up like, hey, by the way, you just ugly. Can we like retreat on that and, you know, maybe discuss that a bit? And it's maybe not the context to bring it up in, but you know,
Right.
It happens,
Right.
and
I mean, that's a great example of how color blindness doesn't work. And even if someone's trying to say, oh, you're not like the other Black people or people of color, that's actually not a thing to say. Like, that's actually wrong to say. And I think that is a good segue to speaking about identity and how you we all hold multiple identities. The two identities that you both hold is that you are Jewish women and that you are women of color, and how you feel about navigating those identities. Maayan, you want to start?
Sure. I've been, yes, of course, I'm a Black woman and I'm a Jewish woman, and that's just who I am, and I'm both. I never really think of it as, it's not a separate thing for me. I'm both these things at once. It's not like, oh, well, let me visit my Black identity over here, and let me visit my Jewish identity over here. You know, I could choose one today. Great. It's not like that. I'm both at the same time. I have to deal with that constantly. I am uber comfortable in my skin at the moment, so I don't feel, and in my spirit and like physically, mentally, spiritually, etc. So I don't feel necessarily bothered by being a Black Jewish person. It's just when someone else brings it up and smacks me in the face with it, it becomes, and that's the time it becomes an issue. You know, I'm perfectly happy to walk into a room and try to allow my merits and my personality to shine through more than, or like, I'm hoping that, you know, other people would want to get to know me for my personality and merits, and not just assume that, oh, she's Black. She comes with this package deal. Like, she must have gone to a public school. What else? She must hang out with the homies or something like that. Like, I don't know, like some random package deal like this. And it's totally not, that's not the background I come from. It's not who I've been. Even as a kid, I think somebody had to try and teach me Ebonics. They're like, you should learn how to be more Black. And I was like, okay, like they're like, here, have a vocabulary list. Let's discuss this tomorrow. Like, I don't know, guys. This is just who I am. like take it or leave it, you know. So yeah, so I'm pretty okay with I'm good with being the Black woman and the Jewish woman. I just wish that others wouldn't judge me negatively just because of the outer package.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Yaffy, that reminded me of something we were speaking about earlier, and now it's slipped my mind. So I'm just going to turn the question over to you.
Okay.
And I'll repeat it a little. The question is about holding multiple identities, and when it feels like they conflict, or if you feel as if you identify more with one thing than with another.
So because I grew up in such a white and in such a Jewish space, my father recently passed away. So I'm also doing this in his memory, because my father was probably one of the biggest activists that I ever saw in my entire life. He would not stop for anything, no matter what, both an activist for Jews and both an activist for Black people. But because he knew that he was raising a daughter into a space that was so white and so Jewish and so devoid of Black history and Black culture, my father made it almost his life's mission to make sure that I understood where I came from. And that meant watching the news, having constant discussions, reading articles, reading books, taking me on the weekends to different parts of the city that I grew up in, and being parts of different projects and different clubs and different activities so that I could better get to know my history and my culture. Having said that, though, when you grow up in a space that you don't have people who look like you, the identity that you share with those people will end up taking up more of your space. And I think especially as Frum Jews in general, no matter who we are, if you came from a family that grew up on an island and you're an Orthodox Jew, if you came from a family that was in the US military and you're an Orthodox Jew, like being an Orthodox Jew in general, I think for most people tends to be first in terms of who they are and their identity. But just because it takes up more space in my day-to-day life, I mean, the Torah is essentially a guidebook for all of us, you know? Just because it takes up more space in my day-to-day life, I don't feel like that is the bigger part of my identity. It's just the part that I've always just been more busy with, I guess is the best way to put it. And I think what also makes things so hard is that when you're experiencing racism in a community that you feel like I'm like everyone else, you know, like I literally was brought up in this. I know nothing else, you know, like I remember one summer my father sent me to a summer camp here in my city, and it was not a Jewish summer camp, it was a day camp. I would go with my little kosher bag of food every single day, and I was an outgoing kid, so I had no problem explaining myself to the other kids, and they were confused that I didn't eat pork and why can I eat the pepperoni pizza that the camp had. But I remember for me, that was the first time that I really was with other young children my age, other peers who were not Jewish. And the kids were just flabbergasted. They were so confused by me. They're like, why do you talk so white? What's wrong with you? You know? So I think that like a lot of times people don't recognize that like our Jewish identity is just as big a part of our life as it is in yours. And like Maayan kind of touched upon, to single us out and to discriminate against us for something that is equally a part of us, but is not in the forefront of our mind every day. Like I don't wake up and think I'm Black, you know, like I wake up and think I need to say Modani and I need to daven before a certain time, you know? So I think that that is something that's also very painful for a lot of Jews of color, that you constantly feel like you need to be put in a category by other people, even when you're not trying to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, thank you. Can you remind me your father's name so we can just say that this is Eloi Nishma?
Yeah, his name was Binyamin.
Okay, Eloi Nishma. His neshama should have an aliyah, and I'm sure that you're giving him so much nachas right now. And I remembered what it was. It was when you told me, you said that people ask you, oh, how can I learn how to confront my racism, or how can I learn about white privilege? And you were like, I don't know, I never had to do that. And then I said, just send them over to me. All right, our next question is something that's very relevant right now, which is about speaking up, how you feel, the challenges in defending Black Lives Matter and anti-racism in general within the Frum community. And Yaffy, would you start us off with that one, please?
Racism in general in the Frum community?
No, so I'm sorry. So I have seen that like Black Lives Matter can be upsetting to Frum people. And how you feel, is this where we talk about how we feel about the movement? But I want to say this, which is both of you should feel free to talk as little or as much as you want. This does not, you don't owe us any answers on this, but I know that you have been challenged on how you feel about Black Lives Matter. So if you could tell us about the experiences, whether or not you want to tell us where you stand.
Yeah, sure. So I do want to say, not that anyone is trying to veer this anyway in that direction, but I want to say, because I think it's very important to say that whenever I talk about racism, I do not like to get political for the mere fact that politics tend to polarize people. And it's so unnecessary when this is an issue that affects humanity. This isn't like a bipartisan thing. Like, this shouldn't be a this side, that side, like centrist, whatever, wherever you lie on the political map. Like, that's not what this is about. Like, we should just care about this as human beings. When it comes to Black Lives Matter, something that's really frustrated me and very much so hurt me so deeply. I live in Israel, for anyone who didn't know that. I live in Israel. I'm married to an Israeli. I have Israeli citizenship. I've been living there for now 7-8 years, and I'm very, very proud of the land that I live in. And my husband only recently got out of the IDF. He actually served extra time, way past what he needed to. I'm proud of him, but it was rough, way past what he needed to. And I fully donated my husband to the state of Israel and the Jewish nation as a whole. And I was really happy to, because it was important to me. So something that frustrates me so much when it comes to people in the Jewish community talking about Black Lives Matter is that I've heard so many people say, oh, well, they're anti-Semitic because X leader said this, and this leader supports Farrakhan, and that person, and it makes me so upset because I look at them and I say, okay, let's say that that's your issue with Black Lives Matter. Fine, you have a problem that they are anti-Israel. All right, take a step back. Is Black Lives Matter the only organization fighting racism? No. If they are the loudest organization and the one that you have noticed the most, that's fine. But if you genuinely are coming to the conversation and you're talking about this because you so deeply care about racism, and it's not that you deeply care about putting out why you won't support fighting racism, then there are so many other organizations out there that are fighting against racism that are not Black Lives Matter. Taking it a step forward, if you do not want to support any organization because perhaps you are an incredibly moral person, far more so than myself, and you really do the research into every single organization, place, thing that you associate yourself with, you as an individual can be doing so many things to combat racism without attaching yourself to any organization whatsoever. And that for me has been the most upsetting and frustrating thing, to see so many people sharing links and stories and whatever of how terrible Black Lives Matter is and everything. And honestly, I think that you can still support the movement should someone want to, because there are so many organizations that people support and turn a blind eye to other things. But as someone who sees herself as an Israeli as well as being an American, I can understand why that's a problem. And if that's the case, there are so many other options, if it's not an excuse and you really care about fighting racism, to raise your voice, to come to the call, answer the call to action, and to be doing things that help fight this. Because this is really an issue that all human beings should care about. And especially as Jews, this is something that we should really feel that it's important to stand up and speak for the other people around us. So
that was so well said. Thank you. Maayan, did you want to?
I second that. I'll also say that, the focus is, there's a time and a place to defend Israel and to love Israel, etc. But right now in our country, in America, we have an issue with, Black people staying alive and other issues that, relate to social injustices regarding Black people. And really the focus now is helping and defending Black people and helping them to get the justice that they need to not only thrive in the country, but also to stay alive. I mean, just to live regular lives. I mean, the list of people that are dead at the hands of police brutality or any other kind of social injustice, it's insane. Like we had this march, the Toluca for social justice, and we were looking into researching, like, okay, which names should we read? And we're thinking like, oh, it's just going to be like maybe a few names from here to there, like, but no, like for the list of names from Eric Garner to I think to the most recent of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, et cetera, it was an insanely long list. Like we would have been sitting there for hours, just me reading names in this moment of, that would not have been a moment. It would have been like, let's have a Zoom session of silence while I read these names. It would have been that. So it's just, we have to focus on that right now. This is, and so, for us to get distracted, because really what that is, BLM doing whatever they're doing, et cetera, about being anti-Israel or whatever they are doing in those regards, it's a distraction. And we need to really sit down and go, blinders on, let's focus on the matter, the issue at hand, and that's that. Let's work on ourselves first. Let's work on, whatever we can do in our corner of the world, like whether it's going to shul and, don't awkwardly just like all of a sudden I went to a Zoom thing and now I'm going to be your friend, Jew of color. Don't do that.
Don't tokenize her.
Yeah, don't tokenize the Jew of color. But try to be a more organic friend, if you will. Like go about it in any other, like the way you would usually go about it with any other person if you weren't thinking about, oh, they have Black skin. You don't think about, you go to your friend, you don't think about like, oh, they have this color skin or that color skin. You say, well, how are you? What's going on with you today? It's an organic conversation, and we just have to have organic conversations with our community, with our family members, with our friends, with whatever circle of influence we can have. Like we just need to start from there and ripple out. It's like the no, what is it? Sorry, I'm blanking for it's the Ashiatzer. It's like Ashiatzer. It's it's saying like if it's like thank you God for all of these different passages and openings that if one thing were off, that would have a ripple effect in my whole entire day and the whole entire not even day, but maybe even years to come. Like that, like one simple little thing has this the strongest effect of just rippling out into so many areas. And so just as that possibly negative thing could happen, we could turn it around and be positive and say, what good thing can I do in my corner of the world to combat racism in my space? What can I do? And think about that, and then just ripple out from there.
So it sounds like you're both saying, and correct me if I'm wrong, that Black Lives Matter is an affirmative statement. It's a statement. Nobody's saying Black Lives Matter more than other people's lives, but Black Lives Matter just as much, and that is something that in the moment needs to be focused on because so many Black lives have not mattered enough, and that you can separate that idea and that movement from specific organizations. Does that?
Yeah, at least that's what I am saying. I can't speak for Yaffy.
I actually want to add something building on what Maayan said, and this was not Maayan's point, but it's something that's very important for me to say. Black Lives Matter has kind of been the loudest and the one that's gotten the most social media traction, I guess we could say, and in today's day and age, that's super important. So I think that's why a lot of people see it as like the face of the movement, and in many ways it is. But like I said, there are so many other organizations and past organizations, so many other ways to help. But something that's very important for me to say in regards to Black Lives Matter that has always been a bit of a painful point is that I can't tell you how many friends of mine, us being super knowledgeable and woke 20-year-olds in college, messaged me when Black Lives Matter started its rise, I don't even know how many years ago now. And they were like, wow, I cannot believe like this happened. I can't believe that that happened. That is terrible. Who knew that police are now committing these things? Who knew that these things are now happening in America? And for me, that was so painful for me to hear. And I understand when it's not your reality, it's not your reality. But I think there's such a lack of awareness of the things that the Black community has for those who are not deeply involved in it or just have a personal connection to it. And like I mentioned, my father making me sit and read the newspaper and watch the news with him. And I can't explain how frequent and how much of just a normal part of my life it was, that anywhere from a few times a week to at least a few times a month for sure, either on the news or in a newspaper article, there would be another Black youth that was killed or maimed or something. And very often by the time that, especially if it was in the newspaper, very often by the time that the article or newscast came out, they recognized that, oh, that person wasn't actually the perpetrator of the crime, or it was actually an accident. There was a misreading of the situation, and this isn't a now. I think that's another thing that people don't really understand. Like, this isn't a new thing. It wasn't new that my father was horrified by it and was showing me it. My father lived through it. My father was also elderly. He was born in the 30s. So he really lived through a lot of very large and critical points in American Black history. And these kinds of very painful parts of our collective history have been happening for a very long time. These aren't new incidents. And I think a lot of people aren't super aware of that.
I think that is a good segue to talk about the police and how a lot of times in the Jewish community, the police are seen as friends, protectors even, but that is not the experience of many people of color and specifically of Black people. And as Yaffy said, that's not a new thing. And just like the fundamentally different way that different groups of people see police. Maayan, do you want to take that?
Sure. Yeah, when I deal with the calling, okay, so in any emergency, anyone would feel, or anyone should feel, like you learn as a little kid that you should feel comfortable to call the police. The police are your friends, they're your community helpers, and that sort of thing. But when something happens outside my door and it looks like a situation that might warrant the police, I have to think a million things. Like a lot of people could just pick up the phone and dial 911. I have to think about, well, is it something I could possibly handle? Because if I invite the police to this situation, will this person get out alive? Will I get out alive? Will all of a sudden this whole situation turn around on me for some reason, Chas v'shalom, and then I'm another news story or something? You know, I have to think about that. So it's like, okay, well, now I'm like, oh, well, do I go out there? Is it too much? Like, can I actually talk to people about the situation that's going on? It's like a weird thing and, you know, I also have to, you know, talk to the children. You know, we have to say, like, you know, the police are not, as much as we would love it, the police are not always on our side. And you know, and for them, it's a very black and white situation. It should be police good, criminals bad. It should be that thing, but it's like, oh, it's like it's like I hate to destroy their bubble and their innocence in this way. It's like they have to get into the gray area before it, like, they could really understand more nuanced things. And
Before white kids have to.
yeah, that too. But just like, you know, there's an age appropriate. What I think I'm getting at is that, you know, there's a time, there's an age for discussing all these more harsh, like, crime, like you could be killed, and like that kind of conversation. Maybe that's like into the teenage years or something like that, where you can begin to say that. But to have to explain that to, say, like a 6 or 7-year-old, that maybe don't go to the police about that. Like, I know your Mora told you that in this situation, in that situation, in whichever situations, you should definitely call 911, but sometimes depending on the situation, we need to take a pause, maybe ask mommy and Tati first if you can. If you can't, like, you know, like, it's not so clear cut. It's not the situation, they'll call the police. It's like, if A, then B, but if B, then C. And then, you know, you go down the alphabet and they're like, I'm so confused. Maybe I'll just talk to you about it. But yeah, Yaffy, take it away.
Yeah, I think that the issue of police is also something that the larger Frum community has a very hard time understanding. My husband and I were traveling this past year as his getting out of the Army celebration, and we stayed in a community where at the Shabbos table, the chief of police of that city, not that neighborhood, was sitting down with us and having a meal. And I think it's also important to say right here that I don't look at police and think, oh my God, evil. Like, it's like laughable to me, because like so many people are simplifying the situation to, oh, like, people think that the police are evil and that they all are terrible, and the end. Like, no, there are amazing police officers there. I'd like to think that most of them are even, but that doesn't take away from the fact that when you have a certain power, it can be potentially life-threatening, and if not life-threatening, very scary and scarring for a lot of people when you don't wield that power correctly. And I remember just being so surprised that this police officer was sitting down at the Shabbos table, not in terms of like sitting down at the Shabbos table part, but that he was such an integral part of that community. I've been speaking out only very recently about my experiences as a Frum woman and racism, and someone messaged me, and their message was essentially along the lines of, well, I don't really see the problem, and I don't really see like what the fuss is, and I don't get why Black people are complaining so much, because as Jews, I have experienced so much anti-Semitism in my ex-neighborhood. And that's a whole other point, because that for me is very frustrating, that people assume that because I am a Jew of color that I don't experience anti-Semitism. I have experienced anti-Semitism that has nothing to do with my skin color, not racism, purely anti-Semitism, because I do walk around as an identifiable Jew, in the way I dress and how I cover my hair and so forth and so on. But that's not my point right now. And she said to me, she was like, well, I've experienced so much anti-Semitism, and I don't think that it's like, you know, the kind of thing that I would make a fuss over to this degree. And I said, that's totally valid. You know, I can understand firsthand what it's like to experience anti-Semitism in a country that you call home. I get it. I grew up here in America. However, could you picture that you are in one of these experiences that you had? You know, walk yourself back through that terrible experience where they called you something, or they threw something at you, or God forbid, they laid hands on you. They tried to really hurt you. What was your reaction? And what was the first thought that went through your head once you could get away from the situation? To call the police? And they were like, yeah, of course, I'm going to report the crime. Why would I let the person get away? And I said, right. So now imagine that the person, this citizen, is no longer a citizen. Instead of it being a random person on the street who accosted you, who attacked you, picture that it's a police officer who maybe you called for help, a police officer who perhaps pulled you over and you complied with. Or picture that, I don't know, you had a child who has autism and your child was acting out, and a police officer saw that and they reacted in a certain way, making certain assumptions. Picture that. Picture how you would feel then if the police officer was the person who accosted you. And I think a lot of people don't really understand that. They don't understand that fear. I consider myself a person who grew up with a lot of privilege, growing up in the community I grew up in, growing up in the neighborhood I grew up in, the house I grew up in. And I can tell you that one of my earliest memories, going back to that question of racism, was also a memory that I wrote an article about for the Layers Project. Shout out to Shira.
Everyone should go look that up.
Yeah.
And the Vogue article about Maayan.
Yes, also that. Hello, Vogue. No big deal. But in that article, I essentially detailed the story where my intent was not at all to criminalize all police officers or say that they're all bad. That was so not my point. My point was to purely share an experience that I had in my upper class neighborhood that I grew up in a house that my parents worked for years and years to be able to purchase, where my father was accosted on our front step. There wasn't a call made. He looked afterwards. He contacted the police department to see if perhaps the officer was there for our neighbor or for something else. There wasn't anything. There was just a neighborhood patrol cop who was driving through and who laid hands on his gun while shouting at my father on our property. And I think a lot of Jews, it's hard to really reconcile the image that they have of police, because they have in so many ways supported our communities. Sometimes not also. But a lot of people don't see police as this thing that scares them. Like, even talking about this, I'm like, it makes me nervous when a police officer comes up to me. I'm automatically nervous.
Yeah.
I think Shoshana is muted. So I don't know how to unmute Shoshana, but if anyone does, that would be a great way to do it.
All right. Thank you, Yaffy, for covering for me. And I think what we're going to do now is, you brought up a word, privilege, that a lot of Jewish people have a very hard time hearing. And we discussed beforehand that it might be more like that. I'm going to answer what privilege is. Privilege is not a bad thing. Privilege is something that you have not earned, that makes life easier for you. There are layers and layers of privilege. So I am Jewish, as is Yaffy, as is Mom. That means that we already have a layer of less privilege than our Christian counterparts in this Christian dominant culture. All three of us experience anti-Semitism. The difference is my skin looks white. So when you look at me, you might see that I'm Jewish, but you see a white person. And that gives me privilege. It doesn't mean my life is easy. It doesn't mean anything about that. But it means that in our societal context, that is one way that people of color experience, they don't have that white privilege. And it's not something you need to be ashamed of. I don't want to push this too hard, but I know firsthand that people have a hard time, and they're like, well, people are anti-Semitic. Yes, and Yaffy and Maayan experience anti-Semitism too. And I'm going to send you, when this is over, to go Google Unpacking the Invisible Knapsack by Peggy McIntosh. Do you want to add anything to that?
Yeah, I just would like to say that I think Shoshana really said it in the best way, which is that privilege is not something that anyone bought or was given. It doesn't mean that you're a bad person at all. It doesn't mean that you don't have hardships. People can totally have privilege and have hardships. Hello, I'm sitting here talking about racism. I just stated myself that I have privilege in a lot of spaces, you know? I did grow up since birth in this community, so for me to walk the walk and talk the talk is very easy. And I have used my privilege for other Jewish friends before, you know? That doesn't mean that I don't experience hardship, I don't experience discrimination or terrible things. It purely means that when the world looks at me, or when certain communities look at me, there are certain assumptions and certain ways that they treat me, most of the time, not always, offhand, on first assumptions of what they see. It doesn't mean anything negative about you or anything that you have that means that you have a perfect life. None of that at all. That's not what privilege is.
And Yaffy, can you tell us a little bit about the concept of using your privilege, which kind of leads to allyship and that topic?
Yeah, I think that I know that some of my friends are on this call, so shout out to all of you guys who have helped me with your privilege before. There are so many times, like, we could sit here until 3 a.m. if I told you guys every single time that a friend of mine, particularly in the Jewish community, but also outside, you know, like when I'm walking the streets of New York City, you know, outside the Jewish community, not in a Jewish space, and some sort of discriminatory or sometimes outwardly racist thing happens, I have had many times where my often white and most of the time Jewish and very often past that visibly Jewish, just so that everyone's clear, friend stood up for me, and just based off of how they looked, even if they looked like a Frum Jew, more often than not, the person calmed down, apologized, backed off, because my friend stood up for me. And this is something that also unfortunately has happened for me many times within a Jewish space, that only due to my white passing friends that I was able to gain acceptance in a certain community or shul or Shabbos table or whatever. They kind of vouched for me. They made me someone who had credibility.
Yeah, and Maayan, would you speak a little bit about privilege and how people can use their privilege?
Sure. Like, again, the 770 thing. So again, the woman, I went like a few more times. I was very determined and to go to 770 and to go to shul and that sort of thing. So went again, these women, you know, chased me out of shul. So by this time I'm having like a little bit of, you know, I'm going to seminary later. That's like, this was like, let's say Hanukkah into like early winter. So now it's about summertime and I'm in seminary, and some girls were like, hey, let's go to 770. And I'm like, I don't know about that. And she's like, oh no, like it's fine. There's a quieter side on the Kingston side. Let's go there. I'm like, okay, fine. So went there, and again, this woman, it's like the same woman from all of these encounters, just like, again, she's like, what are you doing here? It's you again? Like, get out of here. The Rebbe doesn't want you here, and he wouldn't want anyone like you in this shul, and all of that sort of thing. And my friend, who's like, you know, basically white, Jewish, you know, obviously Jewish, etc., stands up to her and says, no, you get out of here. In fact, Rebbe loved everyone, and he would be very disturbed with your behavior. So if anything, you should be the one to leave this place, not Maayan. And so she allowed me to, like, because, you know, by this time I was just kind of like sitting to myself, like, just ignore, be like personal affirmations, belong here, I belong here, it's going to be fine, just whatever. And, you know, I didn't have to sit through personal affirmations and like sit through that abuse. You know, my friend stood up for me and said, no, you don't get to come in here and abuse other Jewish people like this. You need to leave. You're not being appropriate here. And I would say, like, in the second time that this happened with this, like the spitting and the chasing and whatever happened over there, you know, there are tons of women there. They were all davening. I don't think they were in Amidah, so because they're all sitting. So, but in any case, you know, there are tons of women praying over there, but none of them stood up for me. None of them said, this is not the proper behavior for shul. This is not you shouldn't be harassing other people in shul. Please, ladies, sit down. Nobody told them off about their behavior. They just sat on the side and looked to see, well, what's going to happen here? I don't know. So, you know, I made the decision myself to leave in that time and say, you know what, I don't want to be the center of such a big ruckus in the middle of people davening. And the fact that I had to do that myself, okay, well, that's one thing, fine. But it would have been much better if someone else had stood up and said, or even took like, you know, take a page and, you know, stick a pin and go, hey, that's not appropriate. You know, that's not how we behave in shul. And allowed me to, you know, experience whatever spiritual thing I wanted to experience in 770. So that, and I want to add also that at the end of our march, in Ephraim Sherman said he went to a march and he saw that the police were picking on a young black man, and like unnecessarily so. And so he literally just stood in like whatever frame shot, like just in the background of that situation. And the police just backed off of that guy as soon as he arrived on the scene, because, you know, it carries a lot of weight, you know, for the police to be seen, you know, abusing Jewish people or being anti-Semitic in some way. So he literally put his body in the frame and used his presence and, you know, whatever stereotypical thing that happens with seeing an obviously Jewish person, and use that to save another person from unnecessary hate and abuse. So, you know, there's always that's kind of allyship as well, where you literally just put your body in the thing and you know, use your voice, use your body, and stand up for people. You know what's right and wrong, or at least I imagine that most people have a good sense of what's right and what's wrong, and what's humane. Like if you were to walk into a situation, you wouldn't want to be yelled at, walk into a shul or anything, you wouldn't want to be immediately yelled at and accosted while trying to daven in shul. So if you know, you can put yourself in that other person's shoe and say, you know what's happening to that person is wrong. Let me stand up, you know, let me fight. And I think even last week I was reading a mimer by the Rebbe, and it's for Parshas Pinchas, and he says that even if you see a problem, and even if higher ups, like, you know, the president of the United States, are, we're not going there, but I'm just saying as an example, like a king or a queen or some higher up in your community, and someone who's supposed to be like the leader is not, you know, is not tackling the problem, and you see the problem, it means that that problem has been laying out for you to solve, and that you should take the lead, and that you should take the lead on that, and go and solve that problem right there and then, because there's some things in this world that are, or at least in Torah, at least it said, you know, in the mimer, it later said that there are even bits of Torah for each of us to expound upon. And so how much more so we should, you know, take that and use it as a framework to battle the problems in our own communities, whether it be racism or anti-Semitism or anything else that's going on in the world. But we take that and we see the problem and we use that and go and deal with it, solve it.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I mean, that is a really dramatic example where you can't say that anybody didn't see what was going on and had an excuse for not doing the right thing. I think part of white privilege is that we're kind of conditioned. We just see whiteness as a default, and we're conditioned not to see that police see our bodies differently than bodies of color. And so I think once we know more, which, you know, you're both helping us do, hopefully we can see more the differences and work towards that allyship. Now, I'm told to start winding down. So does this mean we have to skip talking about dating, marriage, and shuls? I'll leave that up to you, ladies. Do you want to say something about this? This was an aspect where I particularly learned a lot.
Yeah, I'm happy to discuss this. I want to say on the topic of shuls or hair covering in general, it makes me laugh, sorry guys. I think something that is very frustrating is when people assume that my hair must be a certain texture, a texture which is fantastic and beautiful, but my hair is not. And I'm not going to show you guys my hair, sorry. But I think that's something that has always been very, very annoying for me when people are like, oh, like I wear a volumizer usually when I have a scarf on. And they're like, oh, wow, well, the reason your scarf looks so good is because you have all that hair up there. And I'm like, my hair's really short. My hair's not helping. And they're like, no, but you know what I mean, like your hair. And I'm like, no, like, my hair is very small. Like it is not what you're picturing. And I like force people to spell it out, because honestly, if you're gonna ever say something like this to someone, which you shouldn't, then you should at least have the decency to be direct about it and not beat around the bush. Don't make us chase down what you're saying. That's something that's very frustrating. I know that Maayan also has frustrations about that.
Excuse me. No. Like it's actually, as soon as you said that, like all the things flew out of my head, and all I can think about right now are like my levitating shuls. It's like when my hair grows, so like sometimes I have different ways of keeping my hair. Sometimes I grow it out long and just like flatten it, so like either braid it or flatten it or whatever, like hot comb that business. Anyway, to kind of like get it to lie down a little more, to like yeah, all of that. But then there are days when it grows out like at least an inch or two or something, and then it starts to levitate a little bit, and you're like, oh my goodness. And I always worry about like, oh my goodness, I know I had I always, I don't know, like when you go through college classes, and they're like, oh, kind of like you have to like mask the days when you're doing all of that. So when you're having your mikveh day and all that sort of thing, so it becomes a little. So for me, I always feel like there's a tell, and I have to immediately like I have to deal with the situation as soon as possible, because like people are going to start to notice that every month at a certain time she's either wearing a scarf or you know, or some other weird tell like that. I can't think of like things related to this conversation.
Don't ask inappropriate questions.
Well,
Don't touch their hair. Don't touch anyone's hair.
In general,
unless you're related to them.
Or you ask permission. I think that's a general given for any woman, though. Like you went through all this trouble to get it to be styled in the specific way. Don't touch my hair.
No.
Like,
No,
don't glide your hands through the hair. Like, I finally got the thing to curl the way I wanted it at this specific angle. Don't destroy that for me. No, I'm being very surface about it. But yeah, no, yeah. What Shoshana and Yaffy are saying about this are more critical and serious. But yeah.
Yeah, and with that, I think we do need to go to the next question, which is discussing practical takeaways that you would like us to take away from tonight. And the other one is about calling out. And we discussed earlier that I would answer first. There was a question that was about like how to call out, when to call out. Do I have to call out if, you know, that will hurt me in some way? And when I saw that question, I felt very strongly that that is not a question for Yaffy or Maayan. And the reason is very simple. Racism is not the problem of people of color. Racism is a white person's problem or a white passing person. So I would say, ask me. I mean, don't ask me. That sounds like I have the authority. That's not what I mean. But I mean, when someone steps when someone's stepping on someone else's foot, you don't think, what is the way that I can tell them in the nicest possible way that nobody will be insulted that they're really hurting my foot? Now, it's not a perfect analogy by any means, but just to remember that the onus is on us to stop when there's a racist situation going on, and not to ask Yaffy or Maayan permission to not call out. And with that being said, Yaffy, can you share with us some practical takeaways and what you want to see, what you want us to take away from tonight, as well as and feelings about calling out racism?
Yeah, so I think that in terms of calling out racism, because it's easier to answer, I think that people need to be aware of their safety. If you, God forbid, are in a situation where people respond violently, or perhaps, I know it sounds crazy, but you never know what's going on in someone else's life, perhaps in a way that could actually be dangerous to your life, whether that's immediate danger or long-term danger, then of course, perhaps you are not able to have that conversation with that specific person. But I'm sure that everyone has people in their lives that they could be stopping in the moment when they say something, or trying to have preemptive conversations about this topic. So that's what I think in terms of calling people out. I obviously am aware and understand that sometimes it's uncomfortable, but I think that 9 times out of 10, there's a way to do it, even if it's not in the moment, even if it's later on, even if it's quietly on the side. We all know what Judaism says about embarrassing someone. I think there are many ways to educate those around you without being obnoxious or harmful to yourself or others. In terms of takeaways, someone asked me recently, why am I doing this? You know, like what are you expecting to get out of this? You know, like you're walking around talking to people, what do you think is going to happen? You know, like you're not going to single-handedly solve the problem of racism in America. And that is very, very true. I will not single-handedly do it. However, I'm speaking out in the hopes that even if each one of you go home tonight, or from your home speak to someone else tonight or tomorrow or whenever, and in that conversation you educate them about an aspect of this conversation, something as small as that, or even if the next time that something happens in public or in a space that you're comfortable in, that you're able to say, hey, that wasn't okay, to me, I'll feel like this was a win. I think that what people can do, because that's the follow-up question that I always get in terms of like, what can we do? I think in order to answer that, I have to properly frame how I see racism personally. As I said, my father was a huge activist. He felt very strongly about being a Black man and about being a Frum Jew. And racism was a very constant topic in our house. It ebbed, it flowed, but it was always there in the background. And one of the things that I was able to understand through my father's eyes was that not everyone who is a racist is aware of the things that they're doing. Not everyone who is a racist is aware of how harmful the things they're saying are. Yes, feelings, but also quite literally. And when I think about what's going on in America, yes, with police, but also just with the citizens in this country, because most of the racism I have experienced has not been from police officers, although that is a very ginormous problem. It has been from citizens of the United States of America. I think the important thing to understand is that every single person, you, me, everyone around you, grew up in a specific home, a specific community surroundings. And whether you like it or not, that community surroundings background affected you consciously, but also subconsciously. And to me, the perfect example of this is that one Shabbos, my father went to shul. Once again, he was one of the founding members of this community. And he was sitting in his seat right behind the bima, and his buddy, who was an old timer like him, missed that Shabbos. He wasn't there, so there was an empty seat next to him, and a younger guy sat next to him 2 seats over, and he told his daughter to sit in the seat next to my father. And she looked at my father, looked back at her father, and said, "I don't want to sit next to the black man. He's dirty." And her father was very humiliated. It's like in the middle of Kriyat Torah on Shabbos, and he was like, "Oh, I'm so sorry. I don't know where she learned that." I don't know this man. I never knew who it was. That's not the point of the story. The point is that this little girl absorbed from her very few years on that earth at that point that black was bad, something negative. You have no idea how far the small things that you will do to combat racism will go. You have no idea when it comes to your children, when it comes to your friends. When I think about people who have committed crimes against black people in America, I think about where they came from. Yes, it's possible that some of them grew up in a white supremacist house that told them black people are evil, black people are terrible, you should go out and kill them. But most likely, they probably grew up in a sort of normal family, and just through society around them, the media and their specific bubble learned that black people are negative. So when I think about that, when I think about how to combat that, to me, it's really 3 things. One is education. I think people really, really overestimate what they know about black history. Throughout all of this, I've received so many messages of people telling me, "Oh my gosh, I watched the 13th on Netflix. I read this article. I read this piece of nonfiction. I cannot believe that I, as someone who grew up in America for 30, 40, 50 years, never knew about this part in history. I knew about the civil rights, I knew about slavery, but I can't believe I didn't know about this heinous crime that happened on my very soil that I call home." So I think that the first thing is to educate, because I think as Jews we understand this. When people don't understand our history as Jews and the pain and persecution that we have gone through, it makes it very easy for them to dismiss what it feels like when we are still persecuted and discriminated today. So I think that that's the first step for most people to start at education, to make sure that they're fully aware of where they're coming from. The next step that I think people can do, and with this I'll get to the last point and then let Maayan take it away, is introspection. And I think that sounds very nice and fluffy, but it's actually probably the hardest part. I think that once you're armed with all this information and knowledge about the history of your country and the history of people living right next to you, I think the next question to ask yourself is, what role have you played in this? Perhaps fully inadvertently and not something that you were consciously doing, but what role have you played in this? What have you done to combat this? And what have you done to perhaps accidentally add to this? And how can you change that? And I know that there are a lot of books out there on the psychology of racism to understand it from multiple perspectives, as other people of color who aren't black, as people who are white, as people who are white passing, and so forth and so on. Because I think that as Jews, we know of the concept of a cheshbon nefesh, of sitting down and having like a deep introspective conversation with yourself. I think once people do that, armed with the history, it allows them to complete the final and probably the most crucial on the outside step, which is action. And on Instagram, for whoever's on Instagram knows that a lot of people have been saying, "Oh my God, if you haven't done this, then you're terrible. If you didn't do that, you're terrible." There is no one way to be active in combating racism. No one way, guys. Your way might be through research so that you can educate those around you. Your way might be through asking the school that your children go through to perhaps add something to their curriculum in their history class. Your way might indeed be through activism. But activism is the loud thing that everyone's pointing to. You do not need to be an activist, not in a big way or a small way, in order to be fighting this. Your action can just be speaking up at the Shabbos table and saying, Abba, you know, that conversation makes me uncomfortable. I'd love to talk to you about this later, but can we please table this for right now? I'm so sorry. That's really not something I'm okay hearing. There are so many ways to answer the call to action and to do something to fight this. And I think that the most important thing with this, and this is my last part, is with your children. I think that everyone with their children can be doing something. I think that that is probably the most that you could do, because your children are going to be the next generation. I don't want my children, God willing, one day to be sitting here having the same conversation with your children. I really want to hope and believe that everyone is going to do something to allow their children to be even better people than the people who we were and the people before us. So yeah, that was my short answer.
Wow.
So I will add to that. I second the thing about education. I feel like a lot of the times that I've experienced racism, it's not necessarily because anyone was, yes, there's some overt bits of racism going on, but there are, most of the things have been microaggressions or people just not aware of why the thing that they're doing is offensive in some manner. So really education, I think, would be very important. You know, if you feel, I think knowing the history of our country is also very important. So if you feel that maybe your kid's school doesn't accomplish this in the manner that you wish that they, or, you know, it's lacking in, say, in the history department, say, you can, you know, you can gather, you can go around, see what parents are interested in, and see if that's something, and even if there are no other parents to join you in this in this in this thing that you're trying to get added to the curriculum, you yourself can still go to the school and say, hey, can we add this to the curriculum? Can I work with you? Can I collaborate with you on this, so that we can work together and educate the kids so that when they go out into the world, they can be actual lights to the nations. And then also just general manners. I mean, I'm sure everyone has good manners, etc. But like, you know, just you know, I get the with regards to children, for instance, when I go and pick up my kids from school, or not recently, but a long time ago in the beginning when I would start to take them to school, etc., I would get, you know, oh, are you the babysitter? Are you, my husband is Israeli, so we have biracial children. So, you know, they get varying comments as well. So, you know, sometimes if they've already been accepted as Jewish to the rest of their class, then it's like they see me and they go, oh, look, it's your babysitter. Your babysitter is here to pick you up, or your goy is here to pick you up. And so then, you know, my kid would probably say something like, that's not my babysitter or my goy, that's my mom. And then they would start to question my child's Jewishness. Well, are you Jewish? And on and on. And you know, that child, I don't think that child necessarily came that way. The child didn't, like, you know, they weren't birthed into the world with all of these assumptions. That came from somewhere. Maybe it didn't necessarily come from you exactly, but maybe someone around your family or a family friend or something at the Shabbos table said something, and it made an impression on your child. So, you know, it comes to, we have to teach our children to be polite, have the general manners that we have for one another, you know, open up your mind, open up your heart, and show your child that you're kind to all the people, regardless of what their package is on the outside. So there's that. And I also wanted to touch on I think really education and being humane to each other are my main points, but just like a random other thing, um, like maybe two other random things. Like, speaking of privilege earlier, I should have probably said it around that time, but in any case, my kids, I think that most Jewish children don't have to go around thinking about how white they are, or how pink they are, or how peachy they are, or whatever it is. But, my kids at the age of like 3, 4, as soon as they can talk, basically 3, 4, 5, whatever, they're already concerned with what color their skin is, what does that look like, how is that going? At some point in time, my kids decided, oh, I'm orange. Yes, I've decided on a color and it's orange. Like, okay, but that's not the fact that that they are discussing it, I feel that's an issue. Like that their skin color shouldn't always be put in their face from other little kids just because, and I'd moved them to different schools eventually that, made it, uh, yeah. So I've put them in different schools that didn't focus on their color and really focused more on teaching them more about being a better person, having better characteristics, focusing on education, and not this focus on color and whether this one's a goy or that one's a this or a that. I also think we shouldn't categorize people so much, but I guess that's a discussion for another time. And the other thing I want to say that, I think some people would come and say, but what about my pain? And what about this thing that happened to me? And that sort of thing. Yes, there's space and there's space for everyone to experience the pain that they experience. So, but right now I'm expressing my pain, Yaffy's expressing her pain, and the things that bother her. And, I'm sure that there are other Jews of color out there expressing their pain and what bothers them about the community or the world at large. And we just need to sit and listen. It might be uncomfortable, but we have to sit in that discomfort in order to get to a better place. And I hope that I hope that by telling our stories here, will help you to be able to get into the shoes of the other person, the shoes of a Jew of color, and say, if I were a Jew of color and, based on the story that I heard, how would I feel about that? And how would, if you were to say mirror image yourself and say, okay, well, pretend I'm this person and pretend this is me saying what I just said to another Jew of color, would that be appropriate? Would I feel comfortable as a Jew of color receiving that information, or that comment or whatever it was, even just as a normal human being, would I be okay with that? And just doing that introspective work, like Yaffy said, and
going outside yourself. Sorry. Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry, did I cut you off, Maayan?
Oh, no, I finished.
Okay, we need to end it here. Now, before I thank you, I think that if you really were here and present, then you're probably left with more questions than answers. And I urge you to follow. There will be more events. We're gonna do more. We're not going anywhere. I'm saying that, but I think, I think it's fair to say that. You can follow Kara Velt on Instagram. It's KER_A_VELT, I think. Maayan Zik is at Maayan, MAAYANZIK, on social media, and check out her Vogue article. Thank you so much, Maayan, for giving us this time, and we will do our best to live up to you. Yaffy, thank you so much. You can follow Yaffy, who is an excellent photographer and artist, and both of these women are much more than their racial experiences. They are Frum women who are contributing, amazing, beautiful members of our society. And Yaffy's is at YAFNEW. Is that right?
Yeah.
Is that right, Yaffy? Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Thank you to Devorah, Leah, Velt, and everyone for coming.
Thank you so much for coming, guys.
We really, really appreciate it. It means a lot.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing your time with us, guys.
Thank you. Good night.
Yeah.
Should
Do we just?
I wait for one leave? He was amazing. All right, I'm gonna go. Good night.
All right, guys. Good night.
Hi, good night. Thank you so much.
Okay. Good night.
Your father was alive. I mean, he's watching you, but he's so proud of you. Yeah.